Daisy, welcome to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Listen, I'm glad that your team reached out. We had been talking about it offline. I'm gonna say it here though, because people don't always get a peek behind the curtain. I've actually been trying to get you on the pod for a while, like back when you was at Vice. So I'm excited to have you here.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here, and you should know that I came across your podcast because I had a team pull up some of the podcasts that would seem most aligned with my work and what I do, and yours was in the top 50.
Well, I'm flattered by that. You know what I'm saying? Now top 50 we got some work to do because I want you to say like top 3. So I'm gonna keep on
Oh,
pushing.
well, yes. I don't know what number it was, but I know that it was in that top.
Receive. No, I'm teasing. I'm teasing. So listen, when I first came into awareness of you, you had just became the chief people officer of Vice. And I'm biased because and I think it's interesting we're having this conversation now because when you joined Vice, I was really excited about I just thought that was so cool because as a brand, like externally as a brand, I just thought that they were like one of the few like real countercultural voices, like telling really authentic stories. The documentaries specifically, those who know, the documentaries are genuinely differentiated, just very honest and raw in a way
Beautiful
that,
word.
yeah, just completely different, right? In how they capture stories and tell just how they tell stories. Um, and then though, right? I think it was like earlier this year or last year, Vice shut down. But not only did it shut down, like the library is gone, and like we're seeing this pattern of libraries or archives being deleted, right? Like um, this concept of the internet being a forever place is kind of being challenged right in front of our eyes, right? Um, but anyway, like that was really like a whole segue because I just found it like the timing of our interview, you being advice, being here, is just like it's so eerie because I want to say they did the same thing with I think Comedy Central and MTV. Have you been seeing that too?
Mhm. I haven't found. I mean, I have a lot of my old former colleagues. I used to work at Viacom, and with a lot of the changes that have been happening, really, quite frankly, all across media and entertainment, with consolidation, mergers, buyouts. There's a shifting tenor and practice that is worrisome, and and hopefully we'll continue to have these voices and journalists who are speaking truth to power and creating spaces for audiences that deserve to be informed and spoken to in truth in a way that is not varnishing, right?
Yeah.
And also that is what I loved about Vice most was that it created a space for voices that were not being celebrated and recognized in other outlets. And so I hope that spaces like that do continue to open up.
So like I bring up Vice not just to talk about like this meta narrative or commentary discussion on media and digital and all this stuff, but really because that's when I first came into awareness of you. That was back in like 2020. Talk to me
Yes.
about what has become clearer for you as like a people leader, as an executive, as a voice, as a workplace equity advocate, like since that season, right? Because it feels like 2020 feels like 10 years ago, and at the same time, it feels
Yeah.
like last week. So, like,
Uh,
talk to me about your kind of like where you're at since then.
so much, Zach. To your point, I mean, we are all still reeling from the pandemic and the um, racial and social unrest of the summer of 2020. I joined Vice on May 15th of 2020. At the beginning of the pandemic, I had never met my boss, my team, anyone in person,
Wow.
right? So I was one of that first wave. Now that's really common to a lot of people, but I was one of those first waves of folks that we were all just trying to figure out how does this work? How do you onboard talent into organizations virtually, and at such fragile times, and I say that knowing that we still live in fragile times.
Hmm.
But 2 weeks later, George Floyd was murdered, and that ignited an awakening, if you will, not just in organizations, but across the world. And if you were in the media and entertainment space, you were, that also ignited a space for employees to start speaking truth to power about their experiences in the workplace, right? It was like the whole world was talking about this atrocious thing that had happened to George Floyd, and then people started connecting the dots between the experiences of Black people and people of color, and underrepresented individuals across different realms of society, including the workplace. And it was, I've always said this, that it felt like being at the right place at the right time for me, because I had spent decades of my career building diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, right? And and I know that there's so much talk about this right now, but fundamentally, what I felt, and what I believed my role to be in these organizations was about creating access and opportunity for underserved communities that had been sidelined and marginalized historically, in institutions that were not created with us in mind. And I had the honor and privilege and deep responsibility to try and get that work done within systems that were incredibly challenging. And so you said, you asked what's happened since then. Well, in that summer, I think a lot of us who are practitioners in this space, we thought we could breathe a little bit in many ways, right? We were all reeling from the pain and the anguish, but also having done this work, we thought oh, well, maybe now, right? Maybe now that there is all of this attention, on this, maybe now that organizations are trying to do things, right? They weren't all doing the right things. Advice, I was an advocate for pausing, right? Not for doing all the things, right? Everybody was putting out lists of all the things they're doing so that they could get their employees, happy, and, really to appease them and calm them down, right? And, from a, public relations perspective. And I just wanted to, figure out, what did our employees need, right? Let's just pause and figure out, what is it that they need? Let's hear from them. Let's gather that information, and then we can put forth a strategy. And we did that. We did the listening tours like everybody else. We collected data, and and not surprisingly, a lot of the information that came back to us was the same information that I had seen in company after company, and that we were reading about and hearing about. Folks want to pay equity, right? They wanted to be paid fairly. Who doesn't, right? Sometimes the data they were using was, misconstrued, and their strategies were wrong, but everybody wants to be paid fairly. That was great. People wanted to know what it took to advance. What does it take to grow in this organization? And if you don't have an infrastructure that allows folks to clearly understand what it takes to go from one level to the other, well, that becomes problematic, right? So that's the work there, right? People wanted to feel respected and valued by their managers. Well, I was like, if you're not training managers in the complex and intricate work of managing humans in all of their complexity, well, then there's some work there, right? So we set about to do the unsexy work, right? Which was to create job architecture and job leveling, management training, communications efforts that were not just about the PR piece, but about helping explain to people and helping equip managers and leaders to do their work, right? I would often say, from a KPI perspective, and it's a very generic KPI for sure, but my goal was to ensure that managers were managing and leaders were leading, right? If we got that right, that would have been tremendous. So that's a lot of what was happening that summer. And during that summer and fall and winter, I was writing my first book, Inclusion Revolution, and it was crazy, right? They were all these things were happening, but it was what I love about writing and doing the work that I do is that, for me, work is my field study, right? This is where I figure out the things, what works, what doesn't. I fail all the time, right? And how do I pick myself up and figure this out? And how do I help the people that I manage, the people that I lead, get to the other side safely, right? That's the work. And so during that time, I was writing this, and I was working full time. It was all the things. And I believed that this rallying cry was going to be the cry that was going to save us, that we could use that energy, right? To quote an awful quote, but it's very true, right? Don't let a good crisis go to waste, right? It's just how do we how did we, leverage this for good
Mm-hmm.
and sustainability, right? Because for me, it wasn't about like, let's get this right now. You and I have been working for years, right? And like, I want this to have generational staying power, right? I want this to last. And we believed it did. And, several years later, unfortunately, we are in a place that most movements tend to be, right? Which is, every movement has its backlash. Every movement has its ebbs and its flows. And, the diversity and inclusion space throughout my entire career has had its highs. Everybody gets excited about it, right? And then financial, usually there's a financial crisis that happens. And then all of a sudden everybody stops thinking about it. And then the economy starts improving and everyone starts talking about it, right? It's the standard ebbs and flows. I think the one that we're in now is a particularly challenging one because it is not just solely driven by economy, but it's also driven by a highly politicized political environment. It's a highly divisive political environment that is allowing a lot of the loud voices that don't believe in truth, right? That don't believe in dignity, right? Allowing them to be a lot louder than the other voices that I believe are actually doing the good work. So I think we're in that in between. I hope I answered your question.
You did, and it's a pod, so you're doing great. Let's keep going. So so it's interesting to your point about the cyclical nature, the almost like a sound wave. That's kind of like that's the nature of this space, right? Whether you call it employee experience, workplace fairness, DEI, JEDI, whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
It comes. There's ebbs and flows. There's waxes and wanes. I'm not sure if you saw, but in the fallout of, I'm going to keep calling it a kerfuffle. All right, Trump's last rally. Because I'm trying to figure it out, Daisy. I'm trying to get all the facts, right? But I do know, irrespective of your leaning or what you think may happen, I do believe kerfuffle is a fair word. Plus, I like saying it's a fun word to say. Anyway, a fallout from this at the last rally, Tim Burkett on Fox News, he actually, like, in real time blames, like, a quote-unquote DEI person for the debacle, right? And, like, this is the latest, right? Like, in a pattern of talking heads turning DEI into some type of slur that applies to anyone that isn't white, straight, male, and evangelical. Noted, evangelical. You just talked about, like, remembering what 2020 felt like, what it was, the book, the work that you were doing, and even before that, to your point, like, this, you have been here before. Like, when I talk to particularly seasoned HR leaders and people leaders, I talk to them about, I ask them about like past publicized traumatic situations, right? George Floyd was not the first. Like, I've talked to leaders who were HR executives when Rodney King was beaten, right?
Oh gosh. Oh.
Right. And so so it's not like the first. It's easy to kind of get caught up and think it's the only, but it's not, right? And not to say that technology does make it different, but I'm just saying it's not the first. So as you were in the midst of the season that you just described, did you see any of this coming? Like, did you see this degree of backlash, this degree of animus, this degree of like obfuscation? Did you anticipate any of that?
Well, I'll begin by saying to your earlier point about this person decrying that it is all the fault of a DEI person. I was like, they're on script, right? That's their script. Right. It doesn't have to make any sense, and it doesn't, right? But they just have to say it and say it loudly, right? Like that's what they've been told to do, and so that's what they're doing. And that's what I think about that, right? It's ridiculous. We know it, and I've said this before. Blaming DEI professionals for anything that's happening in society is like blaming the weatherman for it to be raining, right? Like there is no direct correlation, but they're on script. That's their thing, and it's laughable at best. But to answer your question, no, I did not. I always expected backlash. I'm always ready for the backlash because I've seen it time and again. And and I write about this, I talk about this, right? Whenever there's any kind of change towards readjusting the power dynamics, because let's face it, all of this is about power, right? There will be backlash from those who feel entitled to the power, and will fight for it. So I've always expected the backlash. The legal the legal losses that we faced, those have been particularly painful because, and again, I should not be surprised because that's been in the making. And if anybody is in the movement space from a social movement perspective, right? Like there are people far more brilliant than you and I who have been working on this for years, right? I served on the board of Planned Parenthood, and the Dobbs decision, as awful and painful as it was, there were teams that had been on the ground with advocacy work and had been following this, and legal teams that knew this was coming. So it wasn't a surprise, right? Although you will fight to the bitter end, right, to make it not so. So that wasn't a huge surprise. It's a disappointment because we have fought so hard to build rights that are for everybody, right? Like this isn't about usurping someone's humanity and dignity. It's actually about bringing that about for a broader set of humans who have not received those benefits and that access and that opportunity. And so I wasn't surprised. It's the legal ones that have been most painful because, to be clear, we can win that back, right? I do believe this is not the end, right? I have a 16-year-old daughter, and God knows that I will do anything I can to ensure that she has agency over her body and that she has the same rights, if not more, than what I have had throughout my life. And a lot of women fought for me to have those rights, and I will do what I need to do for her and for other women as well. And I'm not alone, right? So I gain hope and optimism in knowing that what we're hearing is all of this noise, and we think that's the majority, but there are so many others that are fighting for truth and for dignity and for humanity. And that's the side of history that I want to be part of.
I love that, Daisy. I mean, and to the last point you made, I have 2 young daughters myself, 19 months and 4, right? So I know, and I think about their world every day, right? Just like, okay, man, what am I leaving behind? Yep. And like, what am I going to do? Right. When they, at least, and I think like, it's just so wild because it's like, they're going to ask you. I talk to people about this with kids. I'm like, your kid's going to ask you, like, when they look at the history or history book or history tablet or history hologram, I don't know. They're going to go, hey, you were alive back then? What was it like back then? What did you do? Because I know I ask my grandparents all the time, hey, what did you do? Like when these freedom rides were happening, like, how did you feel about it? And like, did you want to go? And like, I mean, we have those conversations. I want to keep going because we got some more to go, Daisy.
Okay. Let's talk.
All right, let's keep going. When you stepped away from Vice Media, I remember your public statement talking about taking time for yourself, and pretty much like any communications I saw from you online at that time had to do with rest.
Yes.
When did you realize that it was time for you to step away and recenter yourself on rest?
I think most of us realize it when we need it, but we don't accept and acknowledge it. Yeah. So I will say that it was a series of realizations. It was a series of moments with my body giving up and my body telling me, you're done. You can't do that. This isn't just a typical cold. This isn't just long COVID. This is it, right? This is sustained stress, chronic stress, and you need, right. And I had many, medical practitioners and other experts tell me that, and you keep on going. And in part you keep on going, as a woman of color, as as an immigrant, it's this is what we do, right? So we just keep on putting one foot in front of the other. You are doing it for your team, you're doing it for your family, right? You're trying to keep a roof over your heads, you're trying to figure out what the next step is. But in many ways, one of the many lessons I've learned is that you also do it for yourself, and not for the right reasons all the time, right? There's an ego that goes in. I'm like, I can do this, right? I can rise above this. I can hang with the big guys. I can do all of that. And and eventually, with the help of my wonderful executive coach Ragatis, my husband, my family, my friends, I came to the realization, I'm like, it doesn't have to be this way, but I'm gonna have to do something drastically different in order for it to change, right? And so I had made my decision to leave Vice, and as I was making that decision, it was a very pragmatic one, right? I was like, my contract ends this time. And so at this point, I will move on, and I will now, and I am, again, very pragmatic. I'm an operator, right? So I was like, what is that going to look like? Is it going to be 6 months? What am I going to do at first? And, I was like, and at first I'm going to do nothing, right? Because I just need to rest, right? And what am I doing this for, right? So finding intention and purpose in the time, not just like I'm going on vacation, but what does this mean? So I spent a lot of time laboring over the intent and the purpose of this time off. And, and as life would have it, several curveballs came my way, right? We filed for bankruptcy. Well, I no longer, would have a contract or a severance to fall on. There were business needs that needed to be met. There were, different emergencies as opposed to every other emergency I've been dealing with for years, that needed to be addressed. So, then there was okay, so how long can I stay, right? How long can I extend it? What does that look like? And so I was able to design it partly, right? Because again, like I said, there was always a curveball that would come and be like, oh, I can't do it today. And I kept on pushing back, right? And I ended up leaving about 3 months later than I had originally estimated,
Okay.
but left. And I frankly wasn't going to post or write about it. One of the things I wanted to do was actually kind of go dark and quiet. That had been my original intention. But as things, would go, Vice, as it was the beauty of working for a company of journalists, also, had a double-edged sword, right? And news got leaked, right? And, and so my goodbye note, which was an honest note to the company, and I didn't use the standard, like, I am going to go off to pursue different endeavors. And right, I was just like, I'm taking a radical sabbatical, right? Like, I'm just like, this is what I'm doing. It got leaked, and I started getting like some like negative backlash of like, who is she? What does she think she's doing? And so I woke up the next day and said, you know what? No, I'm going to own this. This is my story. This is not somebody else's story to shame me or to shame others about asking for the space and the time and the energy that they need. And so I wrote this piece, shared it on LinkedIn, and the response was bananas. Like I sent it and I braced myself. There was a moment of, I just sent this and I'm just like, oh my gosh, did I just put myself right on the firing lane, and people are just going to start humiliating me for saying this? And it was the opposite, Zach. I had publicly and behind the scenes hundreds and hundreds of people reaching out going like, you have no idea how much that spoke to me. You have no idea. And I heard from folks who had their unprompted sabbaticals, right? So the many people who had been laid off in the past year and ended up having to do one without wanting to, but then midway through it realizing, oh, this is the biggest gift that has happened to me, right? So I had the people who realized that. I had the people like me that had been intentional. I had the people that were in between. I had people reaching out to me going like, I want one. How do I do it? Right? I had all of that. And that just sparked in me this interest in, to your point, documenting about what rest and replenishment looked like for me. And it wasn't just for me, right? Some of my posts were because I was talking to people. I wasn't formally interviewing people, but every conversation, like I said, that was my field study, was like a podcast conversation, right? Like this conversation. Yeah. And so I would ask, are you okay if I share this publicly because I'm starting to write this, and some people said yes, some people said no, and then I started sharing it, and the response was beautiful. And I write and I share what I do because I just have this deep desire to share my learnings, right, and to connect with people, because I have seen myself in so many other people's stories. And so if I can help somebody, if I can spark an idea in somebody, if I can help light someone's day, that's all it takes for me. And every week, my radical sabbatical chronicles were, people were loving it. They wanted me to write a book about it. I'm like, that's wild. I may someday, but I really didn't even think that, because I felt like I'm not a sabbatical expert. There are sabbatical experts.
Right.
There were people that were actually writing these books that I also was able to amplify, and I was really excited about. But I was like, that's not even my thing. Like, this is a moment in time that I need for me. And part of the generative piece and the nourishing piece. So I had, during my sabbatical, I wrote about this. I would only do things if they matched two out of three criteria. Is it restful? Is it generative, and is it nourishing? And if it wasn't any of those threes, then I wouldn't do it. If it was 2 out of 3, then I would consider. If it was 3, then it was a slam dunk, right? And writing my weekly little column on LinkedIn, if you will, that was nourishing, and it was generative because it sparked more ideas and more thinking. So I loved it, and it was an opportunity for me. So it was an opportunity for me to also share how I went about it, what I thought about. So a lot of what I just shared with you now, but also a lot more detail of, it took this. I asked myself these questions. I made sure that my family was going to be okay financially, right? Like, all of the things that we need to be honest about, I put out there.
Yeah, I mean, it was incredible to read and experience as a consumer, for lack of a better word. And it had me pause and think about, and actually before I go there, let me say this. Something you said earlier about, your body will tell you, or, your body, you feel sick, or, you're like more stressed or reactive to things. And we've had other guests, various like therapists and psychologists, psychiatrists, just talking about the idea that the body keeps the score, right, of the stresses and things that you internalize.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And but also, like, to your point, you mentioned about you being an immigrant. Like, I would love to hear more perspective on that, because I think about myself as a Black American, first generation corporate professional, first man to start and graduate from a 4-year university on my mom's side. My dad taught my grandfather how to read. So, like, I carry a lot. Like, there's a lot of things that I've persevered through where I probably should have stepped back, but I kept pushing through because I felt like, well, no, I'm not gonna, like, I'm carrying a legacy. I'm carrying responsibility. I'm carrying my last name. I have this, I have that. So you internalize a lot of these things, right? Like, I would imagine there's an additional degree of dimensionality as it pertains to being an immigrant to this country as well. Like, you mentioned that. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about that?
Sure. And, I wouldn't say that it's more than the weight that you're carrying. It's just, it's a different way, because it's based on my lived experience as an immigrant whose family worked immensely hard to send me to the best schools they possibly could so that I could be prepared to come to the United States and study, right? There was always a plan for me that, and I should say, because when I speak of being an immigrant, I have a unique immigrant status. I was born in New York City, but I was raised in the Dominican Republic. And then I moved to the United States when I was a junior in high school. So there's a lot of privilege that comes with that, because I already had an American citizenship. But I also, and I was speaking to somebody earlier about this, I was very much of an immigrant. I remember going to, I moved here my junior year of high school, New Milford, New Jersey. And I remember walking the hallways of that school and feeling like everything was so different to me. And I did not know how to navigate it. I did not understand it, right? What felt comfortable to me was class. the class, right? Because that's what I would be learning, right? So if I was in history class, I'm like, I'm good, right? I'm like, I know how to be a good student. I know how to answer questions, but the whole concept of even the dynamics, right? Like this is behavioral shifts that you notice. The schools that I went to in the Dominican Republic, right? We raised our hand. We didn't just yell out at the teacher, right? We showed respect, right? And you better believe I needed to show respect, because if I was disrespectful in that class, not only would I get in trouble, but that teacher knew my grandmother, and she would go and tell my grandmother that I had been disruptive in class, right? Like that didn't happen in Milford, New Jersey. Like the high school kids would be talking all around me and everywhere. And I'd be like, is this acceptable behavior in a classroom? Right? Is this what America is about? Like these are, so I went through that experience. I also went through the experience of growing up as a Dominican Puerto Rican woman in Santo Domingo. And while I went to an international school, I was part of the majority in the island, right? When I left my school, I could speak Spanish, right? I could, everywhere that I went, people for the most part looked like me, right? Spoke like me, engaged like me. Then I come to the States, and that is the opposite of it. And not only that, I am placed in this box of being a Hispanic and a Latina, right? And that box seems to be defined by somebody else, not me, right? And they're telling me what they feel and think about me. So for me, the immigrant experience carries that of having to deal with that weight of who identifies me and how, which is also, as I learned, and this is what I learned in college as I started educating myself on race and class issues in the United States. I was like it's not that different from my Black colleagues and my Black students, friends, right? Like you've carried a very different weight and you've carried it for a lot longer than I have, right? I'm just discovering this. You have grown up in neighborhoods where people have made you feel less than, for quite some time. So it was understanding that dynamic. And to our point earlier about the moment that we're living in and what role we want to play. And for me, realizing that the role I wanted to play was about creating a better experience for all of these humans who were not feeling seen, heard, and valued. And so that's part of the weight. And then the other weight is that weight of knowing that I am my family's highest dreams and achievement, right? Like this is, I've always loved, the quote, I am my ancestors' dreams, right? Like I can look at my ancestors and know what dream, right? Like literally, like my grandmother, this is the dream she had for me, and I'm living it, and I'm the oldest by quite a bit from the cousins in my family, but seeing, and my brothers are 28 and 25, right? They're these young guys that are just brilliant and doing such good work in the world, right? But to see that what I did also created space for them to be able to do what they're doing, and they're going to do far more than I ever did. But it is that I've never felt it as a weight, but it is a weight. And I say that because I always get asked the question of like, what's the weight of doing? And I was like, yeah, it's a pressure that we put on ourselves. But to me, it's always been, this is what I aspire to be, because this is how I give back to the people who poured so much on me.
Yeah.
But we can't deny the fact that in our inner recesses of our heads and our hearts, that is sometimes the message that makes us push through in moments where we actually should just pause.